For 5 centuries, a small Norse community lived at the edge of the human world, between ice, sea, hunger, faith, and distance. They were not simply lost explorers. They were farmers trying to remain farmers in a place where the land kept asking a different question. Their story is not only about survival, it is about what human beings carry with them and what the earth slowly refuses to support. So how did 5,000 Norse settlers survive 500 years in Greenland? To begin calmly, we should not imagine Greenland as an empty stage waiting for a dramatic ending. It was a vast Arctic island, with high ice in its interior, narrow strips of usable land along parts of the coast, and fjords where summer could briefly soften the ground. Into that world came people whose deepest habits had been shaped elsewhere. Their ancestors had moved through Norway, the North Atlantic Islands, and Iceland, bringing with them cattle, sheep, goats, boats, iron tools, stories, law, kinship, and a way of measuring life by farmsteads and seasons. They arrived not as bodies alone, but as a whole pattern of memory. That is where the deeper human question begins. Our species has always survived by carrying old knowledge into new places, but old knowledge does not always fit the new ground. In Greenland, the Norse faced a landscape that accepted some of their habits and quietly resisted others. Grass could grow in sheltered places during short summers. Animals could graze for a time. Houses could be built from turf and stone, pressed low against wind and cold. But winter returned with a patience no human plan could defeat. Hay had to be cut, dried, stored and protected, because livestock could not live through the dark months on hope. A farm was therefore not only a home, it was a calculation made every year between weather, labour, fodder, birth, death, and distance from help. This matters because the title can sound as if survival was a single heroic act. It was not. It was repeated ordinary work, performed by parents, children, servants, priests, boatmen, and aging hands across many generations. No one lived for 500 years. A community did. And no, the first settlers became graves, then ancestors, then names remembered imperfectly by people born in the same cold valleys but under slightly different skies. Human survival at this scale is never just endurance. It is replacement. A baby must live long enough to become a worker. A worker must live long enough to teach. A household must produce enough food to carry old people, young people, and the sick through seasons that did not care whether a family line continued. The Norse settlement in Greenland, therefore, asks us to look at history through a slower lens. Not the quick image of ships arriving, and not the later silence alone, but the long middle when life was neither triumph nor collapse. Archaeology gives us pieces of that middle. Ruins of farms, church sites, animal bones, tools, clothing, graves, and the remains of buildings set into the land. These traces do not speak like a diary. They do not tell us exactly what one person feared on a winter morning. But they do show that the settlement was organised, persistent, and deeply tied to the social world the Norse had known before. There were farms of different sizes. There were places of worship. There were ties to the wider North Atlantic. There was labour directed toward animals, food, and status. The people of Greenland were not outside history. They were part of medieval Europe, but at a distance so great that every connection had to cross water, ice, and weather. That distance is essential. A small society can survive hardship when it remains connected to trade, news, marriage, tools, and belief. It can also become fragile when those connections thin. Yet in the beginning, we should not rush toward the ending. The more careful wonder is not only that the Norse disappeared from Greenland, it is that they lasted so long. On a cold coast far from their first homeland, they turned memory into houses, grass into milk, boats into lifelines, and children into the next keepers of a borrowed world. This is an old human pattern. We enter a place with inherited tools, then learn slowly which tools the place will allow, season after season quietly. The first Norse households in Greenland did not step into a wilderness that could be understood at a glance. They entered a place where the map was mostly water, rock, ice, and waiting. The inland ice sheet was not a field to be crossed and claimed like ordinary land. It was a white interior, immense and silent, pushing human life toward the edges. Along the fjords, there were pockets where grass, willow, low plants, and brief summer warmth made settlement possible. These were not generous landscapes, but they were not useless either. They offered enough for a careful people to begin. A sheltered valley could hold a farm, a slope could feed sheep for part of the year, a shore could give access to seals, birds, driftwood, fish, and travel. The question was never whether Greenland was alive. It was alive in a northern way, with a rhythm older and colder than the farming world the Norse carried in their minds. Human beings often survive by narrowing attention. A new land becomes a set of practical questions. Where can animals graze? Where can hay dry before damp returns? Where can a house face less wind? Where does fresh water run? Where can a boat be pulled up safely? Where can people gather without losing too much warmth, time, or strength? The Norse settlers had to answer these questions not once, but every year. Their society depended on remembering the answers and passing them on. This is why Greenland should not be imagined as a single hard test. It was a continuing conversation between inherited habits and local limits. In Norway and Iceland, Norse farmers already knew short summers, hard weather, and the importance of hay. They were not strangers to northern life, but Greenland made those familiar problems sharper. A mistake in storing winter fodder could become more than an inconvenience. A bad season could press on the whole settlement. A storm at the wrong moment could delay travel, trade, hunting, or gathering. Over time, these pressures entered the body. They shaped backs, hands, teeth, bones, and childhood. They also shaped the mind of the community, though we cannot claim to know private thoughts. We can say only that repeated conditions produce repeated choices. The people who stayed had to become experts in small margins. This connects their story to the earliest movements of our species. And we know, long before the Norse crossed the North Atlantic, human groups had survived by reading coastlines, seasons, animal movements, and plant growth. The Greenland settlers were medieval Europeans, not prehistoric wanderers, but they still belonged to that older human pattern. They carried culture into a demanding place, and culture had to meet weather. A church bell, a legal custom, or a family name could give meaning to life, but it could not make grass grow longer. A memory of home could guide the shape of a farm, but it could not shorten winter. The settlement therefore became a quiet experiment in how far a way of life can travel before it must change. Archaeological remains help us see this without turning it into legend. Turf walls show adaptation to scarce timber and cold air. Animal bones show dependence on livestock, but also the importance of wild resources. Churchyards show that the settlers remained tied to Christian practice. Imported goods, when found, remind us that Greenland was distant but not completely cut off. None of these traces gives us a simple story. Together, they suggest a society that was neither foolish nor magically successful. It was practical, vulnerable, and patient. The number in the title, 5,000, should also be treated with care, because population estimates for medieval Greenland are not exact counts. They are scholarly approximations based on settlements, farms, ruins, and historical context. What matters is the scale. This was not one lost family, and not a great kingdom. It was a small human world large enough to contain memory, work, worship, birth, conflict, and inheritance, yet small enough that every environmental pressure mattered. To survive there for centuries meant that many ordinary decisions had to be good enough, again and again, under a sky that never promised comfort. Greenland also asks us to think about scale. A single person can endure a storm by finding shelter, but a settlement must endure by arranging time. It must know when to move animals, when to cut grass, when to repair roofs, when to launch boats, when to bury the dead, when to teach children, and when to accept that a plan has failed for the year. The Norse who lived there were not surviving in one dramatic moment. They were building a calendar strong enough to carry a society. Along the inner fjords, summer light could be long, but the season of growth was still brief. The land had to be read closely. A patch of grass was not just scenery. It was winter milk, animal strength, wool, meat, and the difference between keeping a household stable or watching it shrink. A sheltered slope was not just a pleasant place. It was a storehouse before it was cut, a promise before it became hay, and a risk until it was dry. This is why their survival cannot be separated from land management. People did not merely occupy Greenland, they had to negotiate with it, using tools, memory, labour and restraint. The houses themselves show this negotiation. Built low, often with turf and stone, they held warmth by becoming partly of the ground. In a treeless or nearly treeless settlement zone, timber was precious. Driftwood mattered. Imported wood mattered. Reused material mattered. A wall was not only architecture, it was a response to scarcity. A doorway, a roof, a sleeping bench, a storage space. Each belonged to a larger system of keeping bodies warm and food protected. Seen in this way, the settlement becomes less like a frontier adventure and more like a careful arrangement of energy. Human beings are warm-blooded animals with cultural memory. We can cross oceans, name places, build churches and write laws, but we still need calories, shelter and repair. The Norse Greenlanders lived exactly at that meeting point, between symbol and body. They could belong to Christian Europe in belief, yet their bodies still answered to Arctic weather. They could remember Norway and Iceland, yet their children learned the shape of Greenlandic valleys first. After 2 or 3 generations, the beginning of the story was no longer a personal memory. It became inherited speech, family history, and perhaps a sense that this difficult coast was simply home. That generational change matters. The first settlers may have compared Greenland to the places they had left, but later people were born into its limits. They did not choose the island as newcomers had chosen it. They received it. Their survival depended on whether inherited habits could become local knowledge. A child watching haymaking was also watching the survival of an imported way of life. A young person learning where seals appeared in season was learning something the farm alone could not provide. A family attending church was keeping contact with a larger moral world, but a family storing fodder was keeping contact with the body's older law. Archaeology allows us to see these layers without pretending to hear every voice. Ruined farms reveal a spread of households rather than a single camp. The remains of churches and burial grounds show that the settlers organized death as carefully as life. Animal remains show that domestic herds mattered deeply, while marine foods also became important. This mixture is central. They were not simply Europeans refusing the Arctic, and not simply Arctic people who abandoned Europe. They were a small Norse society adjusting unevenly, keeping some forms, bending others, and living in a zone where every choice had a cost. The edge of the human map was therefore not an empty margin. It was a lived place filled with repeated labour and quiet dependence. To ask how they survived for 500 years is to ask how memory becomes practice, how practice becomes routine, and how routine can hold a people in place long after the first voyage has ended. Before we look for loss, we have to understand this long holding pattern, where a distant community stayed alive not by conquering Greenland, but by fitting itself, imperfectly and patiently, into the narrow spaces Greenland allowed. The movement toward Greenland did not begin as a clean plan drawn on a quiet table. It came from a wider North Atlantic world where families, ships, law, land, hunger, and reputation all pressed outward. By the time Norse settlers crossed from Iceland toward Greenland, their people had already learned how to live across islands and sea lanes. Norway had sent out farmers, traders, sailors, and chieftains into the Atlantic. Iceland had been settled earlier, and there too, people had tried to turn volcanic soil, rough pasture, and limited woodland into farms, households, and assemblies. Greenland was not the first edge they reached. It was another step in a long human habit. When space, status, or conflict tighten around a community, some people look toward the next horizon. The sagas later remembered Eric the Red as a central figure in this movement, a man linked with exile from Iceland and with the naming of Greenland. These stories matter, but they must be handled with care. They were written down after the events they describe, shaped by memory, storytelling, family pride, and Christian literary culture. They are not useless, and they are not simple invention. They are windows made of old glass. We can look through them, but we should not pretend the view is perfectly clear. What can be said more safely is that Greenland was drawn into the Norse world through sailing knowledge, settlement ambition, and the search for usable land. That word, land, should be heard slowly. For farming people, land was not only ground, It was inheritance, food, rank, marriage possibility, animal pasture, legal standing, and the place where a family name could continue. A person without secure land could be free in law yet limited in future. A household with animals but not enough grazing lived under pressure. A young man from a crowded or disputed family might see the Western Sea not only as danger, but as a chance to become someone more stable. This connects the story to a much older beginning of human life. From the first migrations of Homo sapiens out of Africa to later movements into forests, coasts, islands, and cold plains, people have often moved because the body needs resources and the group needs room. The Norse movement was medieval, organized and shaped by ships and law, but beneath it was the same human equation: mouths, land, kin, memory, and risk. Greenland offered no easy promise. Still, its name, remembered in tradition as deliberately attractive, points toward the psychology of settlement. A difficult place often has to be imagined before it can be endured. To persuade families to cross cold water, a new land must become more than rock and ice in the mind. It must become pasture not yet claimed, valleys not yet divided, a future not yet closed. We should not imagine every settler as a reckless adventurer. Some may have followed kin, some may have sought farms, some may have been attached to powerful households, some may have moved because the choices behind them had narrowed. In a small ship, motives would have travelled together: hope, duty, pressure, fear, ambition, and the ordinary need to belong somewhere. Once they arrived, those motives had to become work. A claim on land meant little without animals, shelters, fodder, tools, and cooperation. The Old Norse world gave them techniques for this, but Greenland tested each technique against a colder margin. What began as movement across the sea became an attempt to transplant a social order. They did not only bring bodies to Greenland, they brought a world of farms, honour, law, faith and memory, and then asked whether that world could take root at the farthest edge of its own map. To understand why Greenland could attract settlers at all, it helps to picture Iceland before the Western voyage. Iceland was not an empty paradise after its first settlement. Its best valleys, grazing rights and farm claims became connected to families, law and memory. A farm was not simply a place to sleep, it was the foundation of a household's future, the measure of a family's standing, and the ground beneath marriages, alliances, and inheritance. In that world, a new coast across the sea could appear dangerous and inviting at the same time. The people who listened to stories about Greenland were not choosing between comfort and hardship. Many were choosing between known limits and unknown limits. That difference matters. Human beings often move not because the next place is easy, but because the present place has become too narrow for hope. The Norse had the ships to make such a movement possible, but ships alone do not create a settlement. A ship can cross water once. A society must cross water again and again through memory, trade, language, and obligation. The first voyages to Greenland therefore belong to a larger Atlantic system, where Iceland, Norway, the Faroes, the British Isles, and later Greenland were tied by routes that were never simple roads, but seasonal chances. Weather decided when a journey could begin. Ice, fog, wind, and current decided whether it could end safely. In this setting, sailing knowledge was a form of inherited human intelligence. It lived in bodies and habits: how to read clouds, how to judge swell, how to steer by coastlines, stars, birds, and remembered distances. Long before written maps became common tools, people carried geography in speech, rhythm, and experience. The Greenland settlers came from that kind of world. They were not modern explorers with instruments and rescue systems. They were members of households and crews whose survival depended on shared skill. The sagas place Eric the Red near the beginning of the story, and that memory is important because it shows how settlement was later explained through personality, exile, naming, and persuasion. Yet the deeper history is wider than one man. No colony could be made by a single strong character. Families had to agree, animals had to be loaded, tools had to be chosen. Servants, dependents, and free farmers had to enter the same risk. Even the animals were part of the migration. Cattle, sheep, goats, horses, and dogs carried the old farming world into the new land. They were living cargo, but also living commitments. To bring cattle was to bring a need for pasture. To bring sheep was to bring wool, milk, meat, and winter fodder. To bring horses was to bring movement across land, but also mouths to feed. These choices reveal the first shape of Norse Greenland. It was imagined as a place where farming could continue. This connects their journey to the oldest pattern of human expansion, but with a medieval difference. Early humans moved with flexible toolkits and changing diets. The Norse moved with a more specific social form. They did not merely ask, "Can people live there?" They asked, "Can our kind of household live there? Can our animals live there? Can our law, our church, our names, and our ideas of status live there?" The answer, for a long time, was partly yes. Not fully, not easily, and not without cost, but enough to begin. In that partial yes, a settlement was born. Greenland became not only a place reached by ships, but a place where the old Norse world tried to stretch itself beyond the comfortable edge of its own experience. Each arrival carried a quiet test of memory. What had worked in one northern place had to be tried in another, and the land would answer slowly, through grass, frost, hunger, birth, and the small success of one winter survived by another careful household. The old Norse world that reached Greenland was held together by more than travel. It was held together by law, memory, family obligation, and the belief that a household had to stand visibly in the world. A farm was a practical place, but it was also a statement. It said that a family had animals, labour, storage, neighbours, witnesses, and a future that could be named. When settlers moved westward, they were not leaving all of that behind. They were trying to recreate it in a place where the conditions were narrower and the distances much greater. This is why the beginning of Norse Greenland cannot be reduced to a simple search for adventure. Adventure may describe a voyage, but it does not explain a society. A society begins when people decide to plant their dead in the ground, raise children under familiar rules, divide work by season, and imagine that tomorrow's household will still recognize yesterday's customs. The people who crossed to Greenland brought that long human desire for continuity. Our species is unusual not only because we move, but because we carry worlds inside our movements. We carry ways of building, cooking, burying, naming, ranking, teaching, and remembering. In Greenland, those carried patterns met a coast that allowed some things and resisted others. A chieftain could claim importance, but status still needed food beneath it. A church could mark sacred order, but worshippers still needed warmth around their bodies. A law could define land, but the land itself still had to grow enough grass. This tension between social imagination and physical limit is one of the quiet foundations of the whole story. The sagas help us sense how later Norse communities understood the first movement west. They remember quarrels, exile, persuasion, and the naming of Greenland in ways that show how settlement was woven into moral storytelling. Yet archaeology asks us to slow down. It reminds us that behind memorable names were many unnamed people whose labour made the colony real. Someone had to cut turf, someone had to tend animals during bad weather, someone had to repair boats, watch children, store food, and keep track of tools that could not be easily replaced. Women, men, children, servants, free farmers and powerful households all formed the living weight of settlement. The human beginning of Greenland was therefore not one heroic footprint on a shore. It was a chain of repeated tasks, brought from an older world and reshaped by a new one. The first generation had to learn where imported expectations failed. The second generation inherited both the farms and the corrections. The third generation may have known the island less as a distant venture and more as the ground under ordinary life. Over time, Greenland changed from possibility into memory. This is how colonies become communities. They do not remain forever in the moment of arrival. They settle into names for places, paths between farms, stories about ancestors, and graves that make leaving harder. A landscape becomes human when people begin to recognize it through loss as well as use. A valley that once looked like pasture becomes the place where a child was born, where a winter was survived, where an elder was buried, where a boat did not return. None of this can be known in personal detail, but the pattern is widely human. It links medieval Greenland to the oldest movements of people across the earth. Again and again, humans have entered new environments with old knowledge, then slowly turned difficulty into tradition. The Norse settlers did this with a specific cultural toolkit: livestock, turf houses, seafaring, Christianity, law, and ties to the North Atlantic. That toolkit was strong enough to establish a life for centuries, but not free from cost. From the beginning, the settlement depended on a balance between what they had brought and what they could learn. Greenland did not become Norway, and it did not become Iceland. It became something smaller, colder, more exposed, and more dependent on careful timing. The reason they came was therefore also the first reason their story remains so important. They came because human beings seek land, continuity, standing, and a future for their children. They survived because those desires were turned into work. They endured because memory became routine. And from the first years onward, every routine had to answer the same quiet question from the land: can this old way of life remain alive here? One more season. A Norse farm in Greenland began with a simple problem that was never simple in practice: how to keep animals alive through a winter that outlasted the grass. The settlers had crossed the sea with a farming imagination, so the first shape of their new life was not a fortress or a market, but a household surrounded by work. In sheltered valleys near the fjords, they built low homes of turf, stone, and whatever timber could be found, reused, drifted ashore, or imported at great cost. These houses were made to hold warmth, but they also show how far from easy woodland the settlers were. In older farming worlds, wood could be cut, shaped, burned, and replaced. In Greenland, every beam had a history. A doorpost or roof support carried scarcity. The farm itself was organized around animals. Cattle mattered because they gave milk and status, but they were demanding bodies. Sheep and goats were hardier, and over time they were important, yet even they needed care, shelter, and fodder. The short summer was therefore a race without drama. Grass had to be cut before weather ruined it. Hay had to be dried while the air allowed it. Storage had to be protected from damp, animals, and waste. A person looking at a green slope in July was also looking at February. This is one of the quiet truths of Norse Greenland. Summer labour was winter survival folded into another season. Nothing about this was accidental. It belonged to an old human pattern in which people survive by turning the future into present work. Early humans stored knowledge of migrations, fruiting seasons, water sources, and animal behaviour. Medieval farmers stored grass, milk products, tools, and memory. Different worlds, different methods, but the same biological pressure remained beneath them. The body needs energy before belief, law, or identity can continue. The Norse settlers could bring Christian practice, family names, and European customs to Greenland, but those things had to be fed by the land. A church could stand only if households nearby produced enough food to support people who gathered there. A lineage could continue only if children were nourished through the years when they could not yet work fully. A farm could keep its place only if its animals survived the dark season in sufficient number. Archaeological evidence from Norse sites shows this world of farms and animal husbandry clearly, though not as a single unchanging picture. There were larger farms and smaller farms, richer households and poorer ones, places with churches and places tied into wider local networks. Some sites suggest careful planning, with living spaces, barns, byres, storage areas, and boundaries arranged around people and animals. The farm was not a romantic cabin at the end of the world. It was an energy system, a social unit, and a statement of belonging. To build one in Greenland meant translating the Norse farmstead into a harsher grammar. Turf walls helped against cold, but turf had to be cut from land with ecological limits. Grazing gave food, but too much pressure could weaken fragile ground. Animals gave wealth, but animals consumed winter stores that human hands struggled to gather. Here the story becomes more careful than the popular image of Viking boldness. The long survival of these settlers depended less on sudden courage than on measured repetition. They endured through mowing, milking, mending, storing, slaughtering, carrying, cleaning, and teaching. Each generation inherited not only land, but instructions written partly in memory and consequences. A farm that misread the season paid for it later. A household that kept too many animals might face hunger. A household that kept too few might lose status, milk, wool, and future security. Greenland did not ask whether the Norse were brave. It asked whether their farming world could become precise enough, humble enough, and patient enough to remain alive at the cold edge of possibility. Inside the Greenland farm, survival was shaped by closeness. People and animals lived in relation to one another, not separately but as one breathing system. A cow in a byre was not only an animal, it was milk for children, butter for storage, dung for fuel or manure, and a living demand that had to be fed even when people were tired. Sheep carried wool, meat, milk, and a better chance of enduring grazing, but they too depended on human attention. Goats could make use of difficult ground, yet they also belonged to the same narrow equation. Every animal promised something, and every animal consumed something. This made farming in Greenland a slow act of judgment. The settlers had to decide which animals to keep, how many could be wintered, where grazing could be allowed, and when slaughter was necessary before hunger decided for them. These choices were not abstract economics. They were felt in hands carrying fodder, in children watching adults work before winter, and in elders remembering seasons when the stores had lasted or failed. The farm buildings helped hold this balance. Turf and stone walls made thick shelter against wind, but the shelter itself required labour from land that also had to support grass. Roofs needed support. Floors needed cleaning. Smoke, damp, animal breath, human breath, and darkness all belonged to winter life. We should be careful not to imagine these homes as either miserable holes or cosy storybook cottages. They were practical structures made within limits, shaped by people who understood cold better than we do from a distance. Their value was not beauty first, but endurance. A well-built wall saved heat. A barn protected fodder. A byre protected animals whose bodies would later protect the household. In this way, architecture became biology extended into earth and stone. The human body alone is fragile in Arctic weather, but the human body joined to stored grass, animal warmth, thick walls, shared labour, and memory can survive much longer than strength alone would allow. This is one reason the Norse story in Greenland belongs to the wider story of our species. Humans have never survived harsh environments only by being tough. We survive by building systems around weakness. We make clothing because skin is not enough. We make houses because shelter is not enough. We make calendars because instinct is not enough. The Norse farm was one such system, carried from the North Atlantic and adjusted to Greenland's fjords. Archaeological remains suggest that marine food also became an important part of the diet, especially seals and other resources from the coast. This does not mean the settlers simply stopped being farmers. It shows a more interesting human adjustment. They kept a farming identity while using the sea more heavily than an inland European farmer would have done. A family might measure itself by livestock and land, yet still depend on seals when winter and distance pressed hard. The fjord and the byre were not opposites. They were two sides of the same survival pattern. The grass fed animals, the sea fed people. Boats connected farms to hunting places, neighbours, trade routes and news. Without boats, the settlement would have been trapped in scattered valleys. Without farms, it would have lost the social form that made it recognisably Norse. This mixture helps explain how a community could last for centuries without becoming simple or static. Each year required small adjustments, but not all adjustments changed identity immediately. A people can bend many times while still believing they are standing straight. In Greenland, the Norse built farms under the ice not because the ice was absent, but because small areas of life remained possible beside it. Their achievement was not conquest of the island. It was the repeated making of enough. Enough hay, enough shelter, enough milk, enough seal meat, enough memory, enough children taught to begin the cycle again. A farmstead in Greenland was never only a cluster of walls. It was a way of holding time together. In spring, people had to open what winter had closed, repair damage, count animals, and judge how much strength remained after the dark months. In summer, the work widened. Animals moved on to pasture. Grass had to be watched, cut, turned, dried, carried, and stored. Boats went out when weather allowed. People gathered what the sea and shore could give. In autumn, decisions became heavier. Which animals could be kept alive through winter? Which had to be slaughtered before fodder ran short? Which stores were safe, and which were already threatened by damp or loss? Winter then returned, not as a surprise, but as the long examination for which the whole year had been preparing. This rhythm explains more about Norse Greenland than any single dramatic image. The people there survived because ordinary labour became a chain strong enough to cross generations. A child born in a turf house did not inherit comfort. The child inherited tasks, paths, tools, animals, warnings, and the memory of what happened when a season was misread. The first human migrations across the earth had depended on similar learning, though in different forms. A coastline, a river, a herd, a fruiting tree, a snowfield, each became meaningful only when people remembered how to return, how to wait, and how to teach the young. In Greenland, the lesson was written in hayfields, byres, seal hunts, and storage rooms. The Norse did not need to understand themselves as part of that deep human history. They simply lived inside it. Their bodies needed warmth, their children needed food, their elders needed care, their animals needed winter fodder, their households needed enough people to keep the cycle moving. If too many young adults left, if too many animals died, if too many storms came at the wrong time, the balance could become thin. Yet for many generations the balance held. This should make us careful with easy judgments. It is tempting to look backward from the later disappearance and see only failure. But a failed settlement does not usually last for centuries. Norse Greenland was a working society for a long time. Its farms were not perfect answers to the Arctic, but they were answers good enough to be repeated. Ruins can make life look still, because stone and turf remain after movement has gone. In reality, those sites once held voices, smells, animals, smoke, tools, wet boots, stored food, sleeping bodies, and hands doing the same work that had been done the year before. A barn was filled, emptied, repaired, and filled again. A church was approached by people who had also milked animals, cut hay, and watched the sky. A grave was dug by a community that still had to return to labour afterward. Nothing in this world was separate. Faith, food, status, and survival touched one another every day. The farm gave the Norse a shape that could be recognised as home, but Greenland forced that home to become narrower, more alert, and more dependent on careful timing. To build farms under the ice was to accept a life in which success rarely looked large. It looked like animals still breathing in late winter. It looked like children learning the right fields. It looked like a roof holding, a boat returning, a store lasting until thaw. It also looked like restraint, the quiet knowledge that taking too much from a thin landscape could weaken tomorrow. In such a place, wisdom was not loud. It was knowing when to save, when to mend, when to share labour, and when to accept less than desire asked for. Across 500 years, survival was not a monument. It was a repeated threshold, crossed quietly whenever enough remained for the next morning. The body gives a quieter record than a saga, but in Greenland, it may be the most honest place to begin. A settlement can speak of farms, churches, trade, and voyages, yet every one of those things depends on bodies that must remain warm, fed, rested enough, and strong enough to work again. The Norse Greenlanders lived in a world where biology was never far beneath culture. Their clothing, houses, food stores, animal care, and seasonal routines were all ways of protecting the human body from a climate that could take energy faster than a person could replace it. Cold is not only a feeling, it is a demand. It asks the body to burn fuel, to guard heat, to move carefully, and to avoid mistakes that might become injury or sickness. Hunger is also not only an empty stomach. Over time it can shape growth, strength, fertility, resistance to disease, and the ability to keep working when work is exactly what survival requires. For a small community in Greenland, class pressures did not fall evenly. Children, pregnant women, the elderly, the sick, and people with injuries would have carried different risks. A strong adult could endure a difficult day in the fields or on the shore, but a society survives only when the weaker bodies are carried through as well. This is one reason the story cannot be told only through courage. Courage does not replace calories. Faith does not replace warmth. Social rank does not make winter shorter. The Norse had to protect life at the level of skin, bone, muscle, breath, and digestion. In that sense, their story reaches back to the beginning of human history. Long before farms, ships, or churches, our ancestors survived because bodies learned to cooperate through culture. Fire, clothing, shelter, shared food, and teaching allowed a tropical species to live in cold lands. Greenland was a late medieval expression of that ancient human solution. The body remained vulnerable, so society built layers around it. A turf house was one layer. Wool clothing was another. Stored hay protected animals, and animals protected people through milk, meat, wool, and social wealth. A boat gave access to marine food. A churchyard gave order to death. All of these cultural forms rested on the same biological foundation. People had to get through the year alive enough to begin again. Archaeology can sometimes bring us close to this truth through human remains, though it must be read carefully. Bones and teeth can suggest patterns of diet, stress, disease, age, and labor. But they do not give simple life stories. They do not tell us exactly what someone thought, or how one winter felt inside one household. Still, they remind us that medieval Greenland was not an idea. It was lived through joints, jaws, backs, hands, and children's growth. Teeth can carry marks of childhood stress. Bones can reflect work, nutrition, illness, or injury. Graves can show care for the dead and the continuation of Christian practice. Animal bones can show what people relied on for food, and changes in diet can hint at changing pressure from land and sea. None of this should be turned into a single dramatic claim. The evidence is quieter than that. It suggests a community adapting within limits, drawing more from marine resources over time, while still holding strongly to a farming identity. The human body sat at the meeting point of that adjustment. A person could belong to a Norse household, speak a Norse language, attend a Christian church, and still depend on seal meat when the land alone could not provide enough. This does not make the settlers less Norse. It makes them human in a more complete way. Identity may tell people who they are, but the body keeps asking what can be eaten, what can be carried, what can be endured, and what can be taught to the next generation. In Greenland, survival was not only the survival of buildings or customs, it was the survival of bodies inside those customs. It was the ability of mothers to bear children, of children to grow, of workers to recover, of old people to remain within the household, and of the community to keep enough strength moving from one season into the next. The cold did not defeat them quickly. That fact alone tells us that their protective systems often worked. But the body also remembers every narrow margin, and over centuries, those margins could become history. A human body in Greenland did not live by food alone, but food was the condition that allowed everything else to continue. The Norse settlers needed enough energy to work, to stay warm, to heal, to bear children, to nurse infants, to tend animals, to travel by boat, and to keep attention sharp when a mistake could cost dearly. In a mild land, shortage can sometimes remain hidden for a while. In a cold land, shortage becomes visible more quickly because the body must spend extra fuel simply to remain alive. The Greenland farm therefore placed a constant question before every household. How much strength can be spent today without stealing from tomorrow? Cutting hay spent strength. Carrying fodder spent strength. Milking, butchering, repairing walls, rowing, hunting, and hauling seals from the shore all spent strength. Yet without those expenditures, there would be no strength later. Survival became a circle in which energy had to be used in order to create more energy. This is one of the oldest conditions of human life. Our ancestors did not survive by avoiding effort. They survived by placing effort where it returned food, warmth, safety, and learning. In Greenland, that ancient rule was present inside a medieval Christian farming society. A prayer might mark the day, but the body still counted meals. A family might carry an honourable name, but muscle still weakened when stores ran low. A child might be born into a known household, but growth depended on milk, fish, meat, and the ability of adults to keep producing food year after year. The remains from Norse Greenland suggest a mixed diet, with domestic animals and marine resources both playing important roles. This matters because diet is not only preference, it is adaptation recorded through the body. Livestock tied people to the land, to hayfields, to barns, and to the social meaning of farming. Marine food tied them to tides, boats, ice, seasonal animal movements, and knowledge of the coast. The body did not care whether a meal came from an old European ideal or from Arctic necessity. It cared whether the meal carried enough nourishment. At the same time, people do care about meaning. Food is never only chemistry in human life. It belongs to identity, habit, rank, memory, and comfort. A community can change what it eats, while still trying to preserve who it believes itself to be. That may help us understand the Norse Greenlanders more gently. They were not simply stubborn farmers ignoring the sea, nor were they people who instantly became something else. They appear to have lived in between, using what the island allowed while holding on to a form of life that connected them to the North Atlantic world. The body made this compromise unavoidable. When the land was generous enough, animals supported the household. When the sea was necessary, marine food entered the household more deeply. For children, these choices became ordinary. A young person born after several generations may not have experienced adaptation as change. The mixture of farm and shore may have felt like the natural shape of home. That is how human culture often works. What begins as adjustment becomes routine. What begins as routine becomes tradition. Beneath that tradition, bodies continue to measure the world in quieter ways. Whether hands can still grip tools, whether backs can still bend, whether teeth can still chew, whether mothers and infants can survive, whether old people can remain fed when their labour has faded, a small settlement depends on these details. It cannot afford to lose too many skilled adults, too many children, or too much stored knowledge. Greenland did not only test Norse buildings and boats, it tested the capacity of human bodies to carry culture through cold. When that capacity held, farms breathed through another winter. When it thinned, the whole settlement would feel the loss quietly through every household nearby. A body also carries time. In a place like Greenland, time did not pass only through calendars and feast days, but through joints that stiffened, teeth that wore down, scars that remained, and children who grew into the same work their parents had once done. The Norse settlers could build walls against wind, store fodder against winter, and sail toward hunting grounds when weather opened the sea. But the body recorded each narrow season in a more private way. A poor harvest was not just a household problem. It could become slower growth in children, thinner animals, weaker adults, and fewer reserves for illness. An injury was not only pain, it could remove a worker from haymaking, rowing, carrying, or tending livestock at the very moment when the household needed every hand. In a large society, one weakened person might disappear into the crowd. In a small Greenland settlement, each body mattered more visibly. Survival depended on enough people remaining capable at the right time. This is why population is not only a number, it is a living structure. A community needs children, but children require care before they can return labour. It needs experienced adults, but adults age. It needs elders for memory, judgment, and teaching, but elders also need support. It needs women able to bear and raise children, but pregnancy and infancy are biologically demanding, especially where food, warmth, and rest are never guaranteed. We should not imagine these people as fragile in a simple way. They had knowledge, skill, and endurance, but no human body escapes biology. Culture can organize risk, yet it cannot erase it. This links Greenland again to the origin of human life as a social species. Humans survived difficult environments because we did not depend on isolated strength alone. We shared food, protected infants, taught skills, cared for the wounded, and allowed knowledge to outlive one body by passing into another. In Greenland, that ancient social pattern had to fit inside farms, churches, boats, and family lines. A child learning to watch animals was not merely learning a chore. The child was becoming a vessel for the settlement's future. An elder remembering where storms had damaged a roof, or when seals had once appeared in a fjord, was not simply remembering the past. That memory could protect bodies not yet born when the lesson was first learned. Archaeological traces help us stay grounded here. Human remains can suggest strain, diet, disease, and work, but they cannot be used to invent a full emotional biography. The honest story is slower. It says that bodies in Norse Greenland lived under pressure, and that the community developed ways to absorb that pressure for a remarkably long time. Clothing from wool, houses of turf, stored hay, livestock shelters, marine hunting, shared labour, and ritual life all formed a protective web. Yet every web has weak points. If climate shortened the growing season, if trade became less reliable, if sea ice made voyages harder, if sickness or outmigration reduced numbers, then the burden on remaining bodies would grow. The end of such a society, if it came slowly, would not need to look like a single catastrophe. It could look like too few hands, too little fodder, too many hard winters close together, and too much distance from help. Still, in this early view, we should notice the success before the loss. For centuries, Norse bodies in Greenland were born, fed, warmed, worked, healed, buried, and replaced by new bodies that continued the pattern. Their survival was not a legend of people stronger than nature. It was the quieter human achievement of building enough culture around vulnerable bodies to let life continue where life was never easy, and where each generation had to learn again that history begins in the body before it becomes a story. The sea around Greenland was never just scenery beside the Norse farms. It was a second landscape, moving, freezing, opening, closing, feeding, and separating. The settlers built their homes near fjords, because the fjords gave access to both land and water. A valley might hold grass for animals, but the shore could offer seals, birds, fish, eggs, driftwood, and routes toward other farms. Without the sea, the Norse presence in Greenland would be almost impossible to understand. They were farmers, but they were farmers in a maritime world. Their animals tied them to meadows and winter fodder, while their boats tied them to hunting places, neighbours, trade, and the wider North Atlantic. Every household, directly or indirectly, depended on that double life. The same water that brought settlers westward also kept them at a distance from the places that had shaped them. Iceland, Norway, and Europe were not ideas alone. They were sources of iron, timber, church connection, news, marriage possibilities, and goods that Greenland could not easily produce for itself. But every connection had to pass across dangerous water. A ship leaving for Greenland did not move along a road with inns and milestones. It entered a season of uncertainty. Fog could hide the coast. Wind could delay a voyage. Ice could change a route. A storm could erase planning. The sea was therefore both door and wall. When it opened, Greenland belonged to a wider world. When it closed, the settlement became a small human island at the edge of a colder one. This matters because survival for 5 centuries was not only a matter of what grew underfoot, it also depended on how often people, animals, goods, and information could cross the water. Human beings have always followed coastlines because coasts offer abundance and movement at the same time. Long before the Norse, early human groups learned that shores could feed bodies with shellfish, fish, birds, marine mammals, and plants, while also guiding travel. The Norse were medieval people with farms, churches, and ships, but they still lived inside that deeper human pattern. The coast was a memory path, a food source, and a boundary. In Greenland, the sea offered food when fields alone could not answer every need. Seal hunting seems to have been especially important. Seals brought meat, fat, skins, and a kind of nourishment suited to a cold environment. A seal was not merely an animal taken from water. It was warmth, calories, material, and time gained for people whose farms were always limited by short summers. Birds and eggs could matter seasonally. Fish may have played a role as well, though the exact balance of foods changed by place and time. The important point is not to turn the Norse into expert Arctic hunters overnight, or to imagine them as refusing the sea. The evidence suggests a mixed economy, where the farm remained central to identity and the sea became central to endurance. That mixture is more human than either simple extreme. People often survive by holding on to one way of life while borrowing from another source of possibility. The sea also affected the body differently than the farm did. Farming demanded bending, cutting, carrying, milking, storing, and tending. Sea work demanded boats, timing, cold hands, balance, knowledge of animals, and acceptance of danger. A person on the water had to read weather with humility. A calm morning did not guarantee a calm return. Ice could be useful or deadly depending on form, season, and distance from shore. The fjord was familiar, but it was not tame. For a small settlement, the loss of a boat or crew could mean more than private grief. It could mean lost skill, lost labour, lost food, and a thinner future for several households. In that way, the sea fed the Norse and reminded them of their scale. It gave them resources the land could not give, but it never became a servant. Archaeological traces, animal remains, and settlement locations all help show why the coast mattered so deeply. Farms were not placed randomly. They belonged to a pattern of usable pasture, access to water, and movement through fjord systems. A good place to live was not only a good place to graze animals, it had to be connected to other places by boat. The Norse Greenlanders survived because they learned to live between field and tide, barn and shore, stored hay and moving seal. Their world was not divided neatly into land people and sea people. It was a narrow human arrangement where each side supported the other. The sea gave them food, contact, materials and routes, yet it also stretched every relationship across distance. In its cold movement, we can see one of the central truths of Greenland. The same force that kept the settlers alive could also leave them profoundly alone. For the Norse in Greenland, distance was not measured only by miles, it was measured by uncertainty. A farm might stand firmly on its slope, with animals in their shelters and hay stored under a roof, yet the wider world still lay beyond water that could not be commanded. Iceland was across the sea. Norway was farther still. Europe, with its markets, bishops, iron, timber, and changing politics, was present in the Greenland mind, but absent from the Greenland eye. This made every voyage more than transportation. It was a thread holding a small society to a much larger fabric. When ships came, they brought goods, news, authority, memory, and proof that Greenland had not been forgotten. When ships did not come, the silence itself became a condition of life. We should be careful not to imagine isolation as complete from the beginning. The Norse Greenlanders were connected to the North Atlantic world for centuries, and that connection helped them remain who they understood themselves to be. But connection across the sea is different from connection across a road. A road can be walked again tomorrow. A sea route depends on season, skill, weather, ship condition, crew, and luck. The same ocean that allowed the first settlers to arrive placed every later contact under negotiation. In this way, the sea shaped not only food and movement, but time itself. A message did not travel instantly. A shortage could not be solved quickly by asking a neighbour across a border. A missing tool, a broken metal object, a need for timber, or the absence of a priest could become heavier because help was far away. The human body feels distance when the thing it needs cannot be reached. This is an old experience in human history. Early groups moving across coastlines, deserts, forests, and cold plains had to learn that survival depended not only on what was nearby, but on whether a group could maintain routes to what was not nearby. Greenland made that ancient truth visible in a medieval form. The settlers had farms, churches, and law, but they still lived by routes. Routes between farms, routes through fjords, routes to hunting grounds, and routes across the North Atlantic. Each route was a kind of memory. People had to know when it could be used, who could travel it, what could be carried, and what risk it asked in return. The sea also shaped social imagination. A young person born in Greenland may have heard of Norway without ever seeing it. Europe could be both real and distant, both home of authority and almost dreamlike in practical life. Imported goods must have carried meaning beyond their usefulness. Wood, iron, cloth, church objects, and small luxury items could remind people that their settlement belonged to a wider Christian and Norse world. Yet every imported thing also revealed dependence. Greenland could provide pasture, animals, seal meat, hides, and certain valuable products, but it could not easily provide everything a medieval European society expected. Scarcity therefore became part of identity. A repaired tool, a reused beam, a carefully preserved object, each belonged to a life where replacement was never guaranteed. The sea made this scarcity manageable when trade worked, and more dangerous when trade weakened. It is easy to think of survival as local adaptation alone, but Norse Greenland survived through both local skill and distant connection. A household could know its fields perfectly and still depend on ships for certain materials. A church could stand in a fjord valley and still depend on a hierarchy that reached beyond the island. A trader could load walrus, ivory, or hides for distant markets, but those markets could change beyond Greenland's control. The sea carried value outward and necessity inward. It made the settlement part of history beyond its own shores. This is why the Greenland story cannot be reduced to cold weather or poor choices. The settlers lived inside a network, and networks can strengthen or thin without one household causing the change. A storm in one season, a shift in trade, trouble in distant kingdoms, changing demand, or fewer voyages could all reach Greenland slowly, not as news alone, but as fewer tools, fewer visitors, fewer choices. Still, for centuries the threads held well enough. Boats moved through fjords, ships crossed the open water, people hunted, traded, prayed, built, repaired, and waited. The sea remained generous and severe at the same time, feeding the body while stretching the community across a distance that never stopped asking for courage, patience, and loss. The sea that fed the Norse also taught them patience, because it did not offer itself every day in the same way. A fjord could be calm and silver in one season, then hard with ice, wind, and danger in another. A shore that gave seals in the right month could give almost nothing if people arrived too late, if weather closed the route, or if animals moved elsewhere. This meant that the Norse had to place their lives within several calendars at once. There was the farming calendar of grass, hay, birth, and slaughter. There was the sea calendar of tides, ice, birds, fish, seals, and safe travel. There was the social calendar of visits, church gatherings, trade, repair, and news. Survival came from making these calendars overlap without breaking the people who carried them. A household could not spend all its strength at sea and neglect its animals. It could not remain only with animals and ignore the coast. Greenland required a divided attention, and divided attention is one of the marks of human adaptation. Since the beginning of our species, people have survived by noticing more than one source of life. A group that could read both land and water had more chances than a group that depended on one answer. In Greenland, the Norse lived this truth in a medieval form. They may have measured wealth and status through farms, livestock, and ties to the Christian North Atlantic, but their bodies were often supported by what the shore provided. A seal taken at the right time could help carry a family through cold months. Skin could become useful material. Fat could become energy. Meat could become stored strength. The sea did not erase the farm. It extended it. It gave the farm another lung, yet this second lung was never fully safe. Hunting marine animals required knowledge, cooperation, and risk. Boats had to be maintained. People had to judge ice and weather. A successful trip could return with food, but a failed trip could take away skilled adults whose knowledge could not be quickly replaced. In a small settlement, loss at sea was not only a private tragedy, it could change the labour balance of farms, the confidence of families, and the future choices of children. This is why the Norse relationship with the sea was so complex. It was not simply gratitude, and not simply fear, it was dependence under uncertainty. Archaeological evidence helps us see the weight of this dependence without turning it into a single explanation for everything. Animal bones from Norse sites show that domestic livestock mattered, but marine mammals also played a major role in diet, especially as time went on. That shift should be understood carefully. It does not prove that the settlers abandoned their old identity. It suggests that the settlement adjusted to the island's realities while still keeping the social shape of a Norse farming community. A people can change what fills the bowl while keeping the house, the language, the churchyard, and the memory that make the meal meaningful. The sea also gave materials and routes that farms alone could not provide. Driftwood could reach shores from distant forests, becoming precious in a land where local timber was limited. Boats made scattered farms part of a larger settlement instead of isolated pockets. Fjords carried people toward neighbours, hunting grounds, and gathering places. In this sense, the sea created community as much as it separated it. A valley without a boat route was more alone. A farm with access to good water paths could remain tied to others, even when the land between them was difficult. But beyond the fjords lay the wider ocean, and the wider ocean carried a different kind of meaning. It was the path to Iceland, Norway, and the larger world, but also the space where contact could thin. If fewer ships came, Greenland would not suddenly cease to exist. Life would continue in houses, barns, fields, and churches. Yet, each missing connection could narrow the future slightly. A tool harder to replace, a message slower to arrive, a market less reliable, a priest less available, a marriage tie less possible. These are quiet changes, but quiet changes can shape centuries. The sea therefore stood at the centre of the Norse Greenland story because it held both nourishment and distance in the same cold body. It gave food to the hungry settlement and carried its goods outward. It brought memory from Europe and made Europe feel far away. It allowed survival and measured loneliness. To understand how they lasted so long, we have to see them not only as farmers beside ice, but as coastal people living between stored grass and moving water, between the animals in the byre and the seals beyond the shore, between a home made of turf and a horizon that could open or close without explanation. In Greenland, trade was never only a matter of wealth. It was a way for a small settlement to remain attached to a world beyond the ice. The Norse could raise animals, gather from the shore, hunt seals and build their farms with patience, but there were things Greenland could not easily give them. Iron was difficult to replace. Good timber was scarce. Certain church objects, cloth, tools and symbols of rank had to come from elsewhere or arrive through long chains of exchange. For this reason, the settlers needed goods that the wider world wanted in return. One of the most important was walrus ivory. To a person living in a Greenland farmstead, a walrus was not a decorative idea. It was a large Arctic animal, dangerous, heavy, and valuable. Its tusks could travel far beyond the fjords, becoming carved objects, religious pieces, handles, game pieces, and luxury goods in medieval Europe. Its hide could be useful as strong rope or material. Its presence connected the cold hunting grounds of the far north to courts, churches, and markets many Greenlanders would never see. This connection is important because it shows that Norse Greenland was not simply a remote survival camp. It was part of a trading world, even if it stood at the edge of that world. The settlers lived locally, but some of their products moved across great distances. A tusk taken from Arctic waters could pass through hands, ships, ports, and workshops, carrying a small piece of Greenland into rooms of wealth and worship. Yet we should not turn this into a simple story where ivory alone explains success or failure. Trade is rarely that simple. It supports people while it works, but it also creates dependence on tastes, routes, buyers, ships, and distant politics. The Greenlanders could hunt, prepare, and export valuable materials, but they could not fully control what Europe wanted, how often ships came, or what risks merchants were willing to take. This is a familiar human condition. From the earliest exchanges of stone, shells, pigment, and tools, human groups have extended survival by trading what one place had for what another place lacked. Trade is one of the oldest ways our species turns local difference into shared possibility. But trade also means that a community becomes partly vulnerable to events beyond its horizon. In Greenland, that vulnerability was sharpened by distance. A farm might do everything correctly within its own valley, yet still feel the effects of fewer ships, weaker demand, or changing routes far away. The walrus hunt itself required organization. It was not the same as taking food near a farm. Walrus were found in northern hunting grounds, and reaching them could involve long journeys, careful timing, strong boats, and cooperation among people who had to leave ordinary farm work behind for a time. The reward could be great, but the cost was real. Men and perhaps support networks on shore had to direct labor toward hunting, transport, processing, and exchange. Animals at home still needed care. Hay still had to be made. Children still needed food. The settlement could not live by trade alone, yet trade drew strength away from local tasks whenever it demanded attention. This does not make the trade foolish. It makes it human. Societies often survive by balancing several kinds of work, none of which can be abandoned without consequence. In Greenland, ivory and other northern products helped the settlement speak to the outside world in a language the outside world valued. They allowed distant people to see Greenland not merely as a hard place, but as a source of rare materials. For the settlers themselves, those materials may have supported status, church ties, and access to necessities. A carved ivory object in Europe could begin with cold hands, wet ropes, boat journeys, animal danger, and the long patience of a community whose farms were always waiting. Behind luxury there was labour. Behind trade there was climate. Behind value there was a living settlement trying to remain connected. The story of walrus ivory therefore opens a deeper question. How long can a small society depend on a distant market before the distance itself becomes part of its fragility? A distant market can feel invisible inside a farm, but it can still shape the work of the farm. In Greenland, a household might spend most days thinking about grass, animals, weather, and stored food. Yet beyond those ordinary tasks stood another question. What could this settlement offer to the wider world? Greenland did not produce grain in any easy abundance. It did not have forests that could supply ships and buildings freely. It did not sit beside a busy road of merchants. Its value to Europe came partly from the northern things Europe could not easily obtain elsewhere. Walrus ivory was one of those things, and because it was rare, beautiful, and workable, it could enter the imagination of distant buyers. It could be carved into sacred objects, decorative pieces, and items associated with status. But before it became polished and admired, it belonged to a harder chain of life. It began with travel into colder waters, with hunters who had to reach dangerous animals, with boats that had to survive the journey, with people who had to cut, carry, preserve, and transport heavy material back toward the settlements. Value did not appear by magic. It was made through risk, labour, and distance. This is important because luxury goods often hide the human bodies behind them. A small ivory object in a European setting could look delicate, even peaceful. Its origin in Greenland was not delicate. It came from a world of ice, breath, blood, rope, weather, and exhausted arms. The Greenlanders were not simply sending objects outward. They were sending stored effort. In return, they hoped to receive things that helped hold their society together: iron for tools, wood for building and repair, cloth, perhaps grain or other goods, and objects connected with church life and social rank. Trade therefore touched both the practical and the symbolic sides of survival. A tool repaired the world of work. A church object repaired the world of meaning. A fine imported item could mark status, but status itself mattered in a society where alliances, authority, and memory helped organize labor. This returns us to a deep human pattern. Since early times, people have exchanged materials not only because bodies needed them, but because communities needed signs of belonging. Shells carried inland, stone tools moved across landscapes, pigments passed between groups, and later metals, cloth, spices, and ivory all show the same basic truth. Humans build relationships through things. An object can carry trust, obligation, prestige, and memory farther than a single person can walk. In Greenland, walrus ivory carried the presence of the settlement outward, while imported goods carried the presence of Europe inward. Yet the chain was long, and long chains are fragile. If demand changed in Europe, Greenland could not force it back. If other sources of ivory became more available, or if taste shifted, the old value might weaken. If fewer ships crossed the North Atlantic, even valuable goods could remain trapped near their source. If Greenland's own population had fewer hands to hunt, process, and trade, the outward flow could thin from inside as well. None of these possibilities alone should be treated as a complete explanation for later decline. The more honest picture is slower. Trade was one strand among many. Climate, farming, population, church ties, hunting, sea routes, and changing European markets all pulled on the same small fabric. For a long time, the strand held. The settlers could remain both local farmers and distant participants in medieval commerce. Their lives were rooted in turf houses and hayfields, but part of their future depended on objects moving far away into rooms they would never enter. This gave Greenland a strange position in history. It was remote, but not irrelevant. Poor in some resources, but rich in certain rare materials. Small in population, but connected to large desires beyond its shores. The walrus hunt shows how survival can depend on what a place lacks and what it uniquely offers. Greenland lacked many comforts of the older Norse world, yet it offered access to Arctic resources that could be transformed into connection. The settlers lived within that transformation, turning cold distance into trade and trade into tools, meaning, and a fragile thread of belonging. The value of Greenland's trade did not remain outside the settlement. It entered the way people organized labor, rank, and connection. A community that exports rare goods must decide who hunts, who prepares the material, who owns the product, who speaks with traders, and who gains status from the exchange. In a small society, these decisions are not distant from daily life. They touch households, alliances, obligations, and the quiet balance between rich farms and poorer ones. A large farm with more animals, more workers, better storage, and stronger ties to church or leadership could take part in long-distance exchange differently from a small household struggling to keep enough fodder for winter. Trade, therefore, did not simply bring goods into Greenland, it also reflected the inner structure of the settlement. Some people had more power to benefit from the outside world. Others may have depended more heavily on local support and shared labour. We should be careful not to invent exact private tensions where evidence is limited, but it is safe to say that trade, status, and survival were connected. Medieval societies were rarely flat. Objects moved along lines of authority. Rare goods could strengthen the people who controlled them. Imported items could mark rank, religious connection, or prestige. At the same time, even powerful households remained tied to the same land and sea as everyone else. A leader still needed hay. A priest still needed food. A wealthy farm still depended on animals, workers, weather, and boats. Greenland made status real, but it also kept status humble before cold. This is one of the most important lessons of the settlement. Human societies build layers of meaning above the body, but the body remains underneath them all. A carved object, a church gift, or a trade relationship may carry honour across the sea, yet the hands that made that exchange possible still had to return to fields, byres, boats, and shorelines. The wider world might admire ivory, but Greenland had to live with the cost of obtaining it. The northern hunting grounds were not just sources of wealth, they were places where time, risk, and strength were spent. During a hunting season, people and boats had to be away from home. The farm calendar did not pause. Animals continued to need care. Grass continued to grow and then fade. Roofs still needed repair. Children still needed watching. In that sense, trade was never free, even when it was profitable. It asked the settlement to divide attention between the needs of the local year and the demands of distant exchange. This connects Greenland again to the oldest human patterns of movement and survival. From early hunter-gatherer groups exchanging stone or shells, to later farming societies trading metals, cloth, salt, or animals, humans have used exchange to reach beyond the limits of one place. But exchange always carries a question. What must be given up nearby in order to gain something from far away? For the Norse Greenlanders, the answer changed with circumstances. When ships came regularly enough, when demand remained strong enough, and when the settlement had enough people and boats, trade could strengthen life. It could bring iron, wood, tools, church goods, and signs that Greenland was still seen by the larger Christian world. When any of those conditions weakened, the same trade system could become less reliable. Not suddenly meaningless, but less able to carry the weight placed on it. The danger in telling this story is to make the market sound like a single invisible hand that decided Greenland's fate. That would be too simple. The evidence points toward a more layered history. Climate pressure, sea ice, farming limits, population size, church obligations, hunting risks, and European demand all belong to the same web. Walrus ivory was one strand. A strong strand, perhaps, but not the whole net. Its importance lies in what it reveals. Greenland survived not by isolation, but by connection. The settlers were distant, yet they were not outside the medieval world. They lived in turf houses near Arctic fjords, but their labour could end up in European churches and noble households. They raised livestock under short summers, yet part of their economy depended on animals from cold northern seas. They prayed in local churches, yet their religious life reached toward bishops and institutions far away. This mixture made the settlement remarkable. It also made it vulnerable to slow changes that no one household could control. If Europe's desires shifted, if voyages became fewer, if ships found other profits, if Greenland's exports became harder to gather, then a little more weight returned to the local settlement. More had to be solved with less help from outside. A missing shipment did not end a society in one moment. A weaker market did not empty a valley overnight, but repeated thinning can alter what is possible. It can make repair harder, status harder to maintain, church connection harder to sustain, and young people less certain that the future lies where their grandparents stayed. In this way, trade reveals a quiet paradox at the heart of Norse Greenland. The community lasted because it was connected to the world beyond the sea, and it became fragile partly because those connections could never be fully controlled from the island itself. The ivory that once carried Greenland outward also reminds us that survival is rarely local alone. It is made from land, labour, body, belief, weather, and distant human desire, all moving together across time. Faith in Norse Greenland was not a decoration placed on top of survival. It was one of the ways survival was given order. A farm could feed the body, a boat could reach the shore, and trade could connect the settlement to Europe. But the church helped place this hard life inside a larger meaning. For the settlers, Christianity was not distant from daily work. It stood near birth, marriage, burial, law, status, memory, and the rhythm of the year. A church in Greenland was therefore more than a building. It was a sign that this small community, far from Norway and Iceland, still understood itself as belonging to the wider Christian world. The landscape around a church carried human time differently from a field or a byre. A field measured grass and labour. A byre measured animal warmth and winter food. A churchyard measured generations. People who had crossed the sea were buried there. Their children were buried there. Later descendants, who may never have seen the older Norse homelands, were placed in the same sacred ground. In this way, faith helped turn a difficult coast into a remembered home. A place becomes harder to leave when the dead are part of it. This does not mean we should imagine every person feeling the same devotion or invent private thoughts that cannot be known. The safer point is that church sites, graves, and religious organizations show that the Norse Greenlanders maintained Christian forms for centuries. They did not live as a loose scattering of temporary camps. They built institutions, kept burial customs, supported religious life, and marked themselves as part of a moral order that reached beyond the island. This matters for the central question of the title because a settlement lasting 500 years cannot be explained only by food. Food keeps bodies alive, but shared meaning helps keep a community recognizable to itself. Human beings have always needed more than calories once survival becomes social. From the earliest burials known in deep human history, we can see that people have treated death as more than disposal. Bodies were placed, remembered, sometimes accompanied by objects, and held within patterns that suggest care. The Norse in Greenland belonged to a much later Christian world, but the deeper human need was still present, to make loss bearable by giving it form. In a cold settlement, where death could come through age, illness, accident, childbirth, hunger, or the sea, burial practice helped the living continue. It allowed grief to enter a known shape. It tied families to ancestors. It reminded people that their lives were not only private struggles against weather, but part of a story shared with others. The churches also reveal social structure. Some farms were more important than others. A church near a powerful farm could reflect wealth, leadership, and the ability to support religious buildings and personnel. This does not make faith false. It means faith lived inside society, just as food, trade, and rank did. A church needed labour. It needed materials. It needed people close enough and organised enough to gather. In Greenland, where wood and imported goods were limited, even religious architecture carried the marks of scarcity and distance. A bell, a vessel, a carved item, a book, or a cloth connected the local settlement to a wider sacred geography. Such objects may have been rare and meaningful not only because they were holy, but because they had crossed the sea. The church therefore stood at the meeting point of earth and horizon. Its walls were local. Its authority reached far away. Its people were Greenlanders by birth or residence, yet their prayers belonged to a religion that joined them to places they might never visit. This connection could strengthen endurance. It gave the settlers a calendar, ceremonies, moral obligations, and a sense that even at the edge of the known world, their lives were not outside order. Yet it also added another layer of dependence. A Christian community needed contact with bishops, priests, teachings, and goods from beyond Greenland. If those connections became weaker over time, religious life could continue, but it would carry distance more heavily. We should not rush toward that later thinning yet. At this point, The important thing is to see that faith was part of how the Norse survived, because it helped bind scattered farms into a society. It gave names to life passages. It made burial into memory. It placed hardship inside a shared frame. On an island where the land allowed only narrow margins, the church helped the settlers feel that their small world was still connected to a larger one. They were not only keeping animals alive, they were keeping a way of being human alive, with bodies in houses, dead in churchyards, prayers in cold air, and memory gathered carefully against the silence of distance. A church in Greenland also worked as a storehouse of memory. It gathered people who lived across scattered farms and reminded them that they were not only separate households struggling with weather, animals, and distance. They belonged to a shared order. In a land where a neighbour might live across water, slopes, or difficult paths, regular gatherings mattered. People came together for worship, burial, feast days, obligations, and decisions that linked family life to the wider community. The church did not remove hardship, but it gave hardship a language. A bad winter, a dangerous voyage, a death at sea, or the loss of a child could be placed within prayers, rites, and customs that others understood. This shared language mattered because isolation can weaken a small society not only through hunger, but through the slow breaking of trust. To remain a people, the Norse settlers needed more than farms that produced food. They needed places where memory could be renewed in public. The churchyard was one of those places. Graves made time visible. Each burial said that a life had belonged to the settlement, and that the settlement would carry the name, body, and loss forward. For descendants born in Greenland, these graves may have made the island feel less like a far colony and more like ancestral ground. This is one of the quiet ways humans become rooted. We do not only settle land by building houses, we settle it by placing our dead within it, by returning to the same paths, by teaching children the names of people who are no longer there. This pattern reaches far back into human history. Long before medieval Christianity, human groups used burial, ritual, and shared memory to hold communities together across death. The Norse Greenlanders expressed that ancient need through Christian forms: consecrated ground, church buildings, crosses, prayers, and a calendar of holy time. Their faith was historically specific, but the human need beneath it was older than the North Atlantic itself. Churches also helped connect Greenland to authority beyond its shores. The settlement had a bishopric, and its religious life tied it to Norway, Rome, and the wider Christian world, even if those connections were slow and difficult. Such ties were not merely spiritual. They could shape status, property, obligation, and the movement of goods. A farm associated with a church could become more than a farm. It could be a local centre of authority, gathering labour, prestige, and memory around it. But again, Greenland made every institution physical. A church needed stone, turf, timber, metal, cloth, vessels, and people who could maintain it. A religious office still depended on the same food systems as everyone else. The priest's body needed warmth. The congregation's bodies needed strength to gather. Sacred objects might cross the sea, but the hands that held them were hands shaped by milking, cutting hay, rowing, repairing, and burying. This meeting of sacred meaning and bodily labour is central to the Greenland story. The settlers were not living in two separate worlds, one spiritual and one practical. They lived in one world, where prayer and fodder, burial and boat repair, church authority and animal care all touched. When a community is small, nothing remains isolated for long. A failed harvest could affect worship. A lost voyage could affect leadership. Fewer ships could affect both tools and religious contact. Yet for centuries, the pattern endured. Churches stood, graves accumulated, rituals continued, and people kept placing their lives inside a tradition larger than their own households. Faith did not make Greenland gentle. It did not change the length of winter or guarantee ships from abroad, but it helped the settlers keep continuity in a place where the physical world often threatened continuity. It gave a scattered society a centre, and it allowed generations to feel that their difficult coast was not outside human meaning under the same cold sky. Faith also helped the Norse Greenlanders measure distance. A person standing near a church in a fjord settlement could be far from Norway, far from Rome, far from the busy centres of medieval Europe, and still feel joined to them through prayer, authority, and ritual. That connection was not instant, and it was not always secure, but it mattered because it told the settlers that their lives at the edge of the map were not outside the known moral world. They were farmers under Arctic light, but also Christians within a larger order. A burial in Greenland could follow forms recognized far beyond the island. A feast day could place a remote household into the same sacred calendar as people across the sea. A church object, perhaps carried by ship through difficult water, could bring the wider world into a small cold room where local hands touched something made elsewhere. These details show why religious life was part of survival, not a separate ornament. Human beings do not endure for generations by food alone. They need ways to explain duty, loss, inheritance, and belonging. The Norse in Greenland had to keep bodies alive, but they also had to keep society coherent enough for children to inherit it. Faith helped give shape to that inheritance. It taught people when to gather, how to bury, how to mark marriage and birth, how to place suffering inside a story that others understood. The churchyard, in particular, turned time into visible ground. Each grave added weight to the settlement's memory. The first dead may have still belonged in memory to Iceland or Norway, but later generations lay in Greenland soil, making the island less like a temporary outpost and more like ancestral land. That transformation is deeply human. From the earliest communities that treated the dead with care, people have used burial to make a place morally charged. A landscape becomes home not only when it feeds the living, but when it holds the dead. In Greenland, this mattered because leaving was never only a practical decision. To abandon a farm was to abandon walls, fields, paths, memories, and graves. It was to loosen a bond that had been strengthened by generations. The church also preserved hierarchy. Some places became centres because they combined land, wealth, worship, and authority. A powerful farm near a church could gather people not only through food production, but through ritual importance. This gave the settlement structure. Scattered households needed centres of gravity. Without them, the long distances between farms could become social distance as well. Yet the same structure could carry burdens. Religious life required support. Buildings had to be maintained. Priests needed food. Sacred objects had to be obtained, repaired, protected, and sometimes imported. Connections with bishops and the wider church depended on ships and messages. In a more central land, such needs might be difficult but ordinary. In Greenland, every outside connection crossed water that could fail. The church therefore revealed both the strength and the vulnerability of Norse identity. It made Greenland part of Europe, but it also reminded Greenland how far away Europe was. A settlement could keep its faith for a long time, even with reduced contact, because belief lives in habit, memory, and local practice. But the thinner the contact became, the more the community had to carry by itself. This does not mean their faith simply weakened in a straight line. History is rarely that neat. It means religious life, like farming and trade, depended on a web of conditions. Food, population, ships, materials, leadership, and memory all supported it together. When those conditions were stable enough, the church helped bind the people into continuity. When pressures increased, the same institution could become harder to sustain. Still, we should pause before turning that difficulty into failure. For centuries, the Norse Greenlanders maintained churches, burial grounds, and Christian customs in a place where nothing unnecessary would have survived easily. That fact alone shows commitment. It shows that they were not merely clinging to life in a biological sense. They were preserving a way of being human that linked the living, the dead, the land, and the world beyond the sea. In the end, faith shaped memory because it allowed a cold settlement to understand itself as more than scattered farms. It gave the Norse a language for belonging at the very edge of belonging. Their houses held warmth, their barns held animals, their boats held roots across water, and their churches held the fragile idea that even here, under the long northern sky, human life could still be ordered, remembered, and made meaningful. The Norse were not the only people whose lives touched Greenland. Long before and during the centuries of Norse settlement, the Arctic world held other human traditions, each shaped by its own knowledge of cold, sea, animals, and movement. In the later medieval period, people associated with the Thule culture, ancestors of modern Inuit, moved into Greenland from the north and west. Their way of life had been formed in a different Arctic grammar from that of the Norse farmers. They were skilled in technologies and habits suited to marine hunting, sea ice, kayaks, skin boats, dogs, harpoons, seasonal movement, and the close reading of Arctic animals. To place them beside the Norse is not to create a simple contrast between success and failure, or wisdom and stubbornness. It is to see that Greenland contained more than one human answer to the same hard environment. The Norse brought cattle, sheep, turf farms, churches, law, and a memory of the North Atlantic farming world. Inuit communities brought a deeper Arctic toolkit, more closely fitted to hunting seals, whales, fish, and other northern resources through flexible movement and specialized equipment. Both were human strategies. Both required intelligence, teaching, cooperation, and courage, but they began from different assumptions about what a good life should be built around. For the Norse, land and livestock remained central to identity, even when the sea became increasingly important for food. For Inuit communities, the sea and moving animals were not secondary supports to a farm. They were central to life itself. This difference matters because adaptation is not only a list of tools, it is also a way of seeing the world. A Norse household might look at a sheltered valley and think of pasture, hay, barns, and winter fodder. An Inuit hunter might look at ice, water, weather, and animal movement with a knowledge trained by another history. The same place could offer different meanings to different people. This is an old truth of human evolution. Our species did not spread across the earth with one perfect method. We survived because groups developed local knowledge, how to live with deserts, forests, coasts, mountains, grasslands, rivers, and ice. Culture became the second skin of the human body. In Greenland, two cultural skins met near the edge of the Arctic. The evidence for contact between Norse and Inuit worlds must be handled carefully. There are written accounts, archaeological finds, objects moving between groups, and later traditions, but they do not support a single easy story. It would be misleading to say that their relationship was only peaceful exchange. It would also be misleading to say that it was only conflict. The truth appears more mixed and uneven, with possible trade, observation, avoidance, tension, and occasional violence over time and place. Small societies at the edge of survival do not meet one another in a vacuum. They meet through needs: metal, skins, food, boats, hunting knowledge, territory, curiosity, fear, and misunderstanding. The Norse may have had things Inuit people valued, especially metal, which was scarce and useful. Inuit communities may have had knowledge and materials strongly suited to Arctic life. Yet, contact does not automatically mean deep cultural borrowing. People can live near a better technique and still not adopt it fully, because tools belong to whole systems. A kayak is not just an object. It belongs to training, materials, hunting methods, social habits, and years of learning. A farm is not just land. It belongs to animals, inheritance, identity, church, and status. This is why the meeting of Norse and Inuit worlds should be told slowly. It was not a simple lesson in which one group knew the answer and the other refused it. It was a meeting between two long histories, each carrying its own memory of how humans should live with cold, hunger, water, and time. Contact between Norse and Inuit worlds, as it happened, must have been shaped first by observation. Before trust, before exchange, before fear or conflict, people notice one another. A boat moving through a fjord can be seen from ashore. Smoke, footprints, hunting remains, abandoned objects and paths across snow can tell one group that another has passed nearby. In Greenland, where usable places were limited and seasons mattered deeply, human presence would not remain invisible forever. Yet noticing is not the same as understanding. The Norse looked out from farms, churches, and a memory of the North Atlantic. Inuit communities moved through an Arctic world organized by sea mammals, ice, flexible camps, dogs, and specialized hunting tools. Each group could see the other's actions without immediately knowing the whole system behind them. A metal tool in Inuit hands might have a value different from its value in a Norse household. A kayak or skin boat seen by Norse eyes might appear useful, but usefulness alone does not make a technology easy to adopt. Every tool carries a childhood of training behind it. Every method belongs to a social world. The Norse had boats, but their boats came from another tradition of wood, crews, cargo, and open water travel. Inuit hunting craft belonged to materials, balance, clothing, weather knowledge, and body skills learned slowly. A person cannot simply decide to become competent in such a system when hunger is already near. This is why cultural contact should not be reduced to a simple question of copying. Humans learn from neighbours, but we also remain bound by the habits that formed us. The earliest human groups who met one another across landscapes must have faced similar limits. A new technique could be admired, traded for, feared, or misunderstood, but it became truly useful only when woven into daily teaching. In Greenland, the Norse and Inuit carried two different histories of teaching. One history taught children to read pasture, animals, hay, and Christian community. The other taught children to read ice, marine animals, movement, and Arctic tools with extraordinary precision. Neither history was a small thing. Evidence of interaction is fragmentary, so we have to speak carefully. Some Norse objects appear in Inuit contexts, and written Norse sources mention encounters, though often through the narrow language of outsiders describing people they did not fully understand. These traces suggest contact, but they do not let us reconstruct every meeting. There may have been trade, there may have been avoidance, there may have been moments of violence, there may have been curiosity at a distance, with each side learning enough to recognize the other without becoming the other. The important point is that Greenland was not culturally empty around the Norse settlements. It was a living Arctic region where another human adaptation was becoming stronger. This placed the Norse story inside a larger human comparison. Their survival was impressive, but it was not the only possible answer to Greenland. Inuit communities show that a life built more directly around sea ice and marine hunting could fit the Arctic in ways a livestock-centered settlement struggled to do. Still, we should not turn that comparison into blame. A Norse farmer could not abandon cattle, church, inheritance, houses, law, and status as if removing a coat. Those things were not decorations. They were the structure of belonging. To change too deeply might have meant losing the social world that made life meaningful. Yet to change too little could also narrow survival. Between those two dangers, small societies make choices slowly, often without seeing their full consequence. The meeting with Inuit worlds therefore reveals one of the most delicate questions in the Greenland story. When another human way of living beside you seems better fitted to the land, how much can your own world bend before it no longer feels like home? That question remained quietly open across generations. The presence of Inuit communities near the Norse settlements makes the Greenland story more careful, not simpler. It shows that the island was not only a hard environment, but a place where different human traditions met the same cold world with different knowledge. The Norse knew farms, livestock, hay, turf houses, churches, law, and long sea routes. Inuit communities linked with the Thule tradition knew a more Arctic pattern of life, shaped around sea mammals, sea ice, dogs, skin boats, seasonal movement, and close attention to weather and animals. These were not small differences in tools. They were different ways of training the eye. A Norse farmer might look at a valley and think of pasture, fodder, barns, and winter survival. An Inuit hunter might look at ice, water, wind, and animal movement and see another kind of map. Both forms of knowledge were intelligent. Both were learned slowly. Both belonged to children, elders, hands, stories, and practice. This is why we should be cautious when asking why the Norse did not simply become more like their Inuit neighbours. A tool is never only a tool. A kayak belongs to balance, clothing, materials, hunting habits, and years of bodily training. A dog sled belongs to dogs, routes, snow knowledge, and social routines. A harpoon system belongs to animal behaviour, sea ice, repair skills, and timing. In the same way, a Norse farm was not just a building beside grass. It belonged to inheritance, livestock, churchyards, marriage, status, stored hay, and the memory of the North Atlantic world. To borrow one object deeply may require borrowing the life around it. People can observe a better fit without being able to step into it easily. This touches an older human truth. Our species spread across the earth because culture allowed weak bodies to become locally skilled. Humans learned deserts, forests, coasts, rivers, mountains, and ice through shared practice. but culture also gives people loyalty to what has already carried them. The Norse had survived for centuries across northern seas because their farming world was strong, organized, and meaningful. Inuit communities endured in the Arctic because their own knowledge was precise and deeply fitted to ice and marine animals. When these worlds met, neither was empty. Each carried a long history. The evidence for contact remains uneven. Objects may have moved between groups. Encounters may have included trade, distance, curiosity, fear, misunderstanding, and sometimes conflict. We do not have enough evidence to turn their relationship into one clean story. The honest picture is mixed. Knowledge may have been noticed without being fully adopted. Materials may have been valued more easily than trust. A small piece of metal could move from one world into another faster than a whole way of life could move with it. This matters for the central question of survival. The Norse were not failing because they lacked intelligence. They were living inside a structure that had worked long enough to feel natural. Their farms, animals, churches, graves, and trade ties held them in a recognizable shape. Greenland, however, kept asking for flexibility. The land narrowed farming. The sea offered food but danger. Distance weakened connection. Inuit life showed another human answer to the Arctic, but seeing another answer is not the same as becoming it. A community can bend many times and still remain itself, yet there is always a limit beyond which bending becomes another identity. That limit is difficult to see while people are living through it. In Greenland, the meeting of Norse and Inuit worlds reminds us that survival depends not only on strength, but on the ability to change without losing the social memory that makes life feel like home. Their lives therefore stand beside one another, not as a simple lesson of right and wrong, but as evidence that human adaptation is always tied to belonging, memory, and the slow training of the body itself. Climate did not need to arrive as a sudden disaster to change Norse Greenland. It could work more quietly, by shortening a season, delaying a thaw, cooling a summer, thickening sea ice, or making hay just a little harder to dry. A society at the edge of farming does not require a dramatic collapse before it begins to feel pressure. It only needs the margin between enough and not enough to become thinner. For the Norse, that margin was often measured in grass. Grass became hay. Hay became winter fodder. Winter fodder kept animals alive. Living animals gave milk, meat, wool, status, and the possibility of another year. When the growing season was generous enough, this chain could hold. When the season became shorter or wetter or less predictable, the weakness could move through the whole household. A field that looked only slightly poorer in summer might become a hungry buyer in late winter. A few animals lost might mean less milk, less wealth, and fewer choices in the next year. This is how climate often enters human history. It does not always strike like a weapon. It narrows the room in which people can make decisions. The Norse settlers had chosen the sheltered parts of Greenland because those places offered a possible farming life. They were not trying to farm the ice sheet. They lived along fjords, where summer warmth and pasture could exist for a time. But these usable places were limited from the beginning. A small change in temperature, moisture, or ice conditions mattered more there than it might in a richer agricultural zone. This connects their story to the oldest human problem. From the first movements of our species, people survived by reading the difference between a place that could support life and a place that could not. In Greenland, that difference was not a fixed line. It moved slowly with weather, season, soil, and sea. The settlers had to live on a boundary that could shift beneath them. We should be careful with the idea of the Little Ice Age. It was not a single switch that suddenly turned the world cold everywhere at once. It was a broad period of cooler and more variable conditions affecting different regions in different ways. For Greenland, the important point is not a dramatic label, but the practical effect. Colder or less predictable conditions could make farming harder, travel riskier, and communication with the outside world less reliable. More sea ice could interfere with voyages. Storms and colder waters could make hunting and trade more dangerous. Shorter summers could reduce hay production. These pressures did not act alone. They joined older limits already present in the settlement. Soil also mattered. Greenland's usable land was fragile. Turf could build warm walls, but cutting turf changed the ground. Grazing animals could feed a household, but too much pressure could weaken vegetation. Wood was scarce, so people depended heavily on turf, stone, driftwood, and imported materials. In such a landscape, survival required restraint as much as labour. If the land was asked to give too much, it might answer with erosion, poorer pasture, and less resilience when cold years came. Again, this should not be turned into blame. The settlers were not careless outsiders who simply ruined a perfect environment. They were farmers trying to live within a narrow ecological space, making choices that may have seemed reasonable in each season. The danger was that many reasonable choices, repeated for generations under worsening conditions, could leave less room for recovery. Climate, soil, and farming limits therefore formed a slow pressure around the Norse world. Their society had lasted because it was organized, skilled, and persistent. But persistence does not make a landscape larger. Skill does not make summer longer. When the environment tightened, every other part of life felt it. Bodies, animals, trade, church, travel, and the confidence that children would inherit the same workable world their grandparents had known. The pressure of climate becomes easier to understand when we follow it into one ordinary year. Imagine a winter that lasts a little longer than expected, not in a sudden impossible way, but with enough cold to delay the first useful growth. Animals come out of the dark season thinner. Stored fodder has been used carefully, perhaps too carefully, and the household waits for grass with a kind of practical attention. Spring does not need to fail completely to cause trouble. It only needs to arrive late. Then summer must do more work in less time. The grass has to grow, be cut, dry, and become safe hay before damp weather returns. If rain comes at the wrong moment, if warmth is weak, if hands are few, if tools break, the farm does not simply lose a pleasant season, it loses part of its winter future. In Greenland, time was stored in hay. Warm days were stored in barns. The sun of July had to feed animals in February. This is why climate pressure was so intimate. It entered the household through the floor of the byre, the level of a storage space, the weight of an animal's body, and the tiredness of people who had to do more while receiving less. A richer farming region might absorb a bad year with larger fields, wider trade, or more surplus. Norse Greenland had less room to absorb error. Its farms stood in the narrow, usable edges of a vast island, and the interior ice gave no extra pasture when the coastal margins were strained. This narrowness connects their experience to a deep human pattern. From the earliest human movements into new landscapes, survival has depended on buffers. A group needs more than today's food. It needs stored knowledge, stored energy, stored relationships, and stored options. When buffers shrink, the same people with the same intelligence become more vulnerable. The Norse Greenlanders did not suddenly forget how to farm. Their inherited skills did not vanish. The problem was that the conditions around those skills may have changed slowly enough to make each adjustment seem temporary, while the long direction became harder to reverse. A family might keep fewer cattle and more sheep or goats. It might rely more on seals. It might repair rather than replace. It might send people farther for hunting or materials. Each choice could make sense. But each choice also revealed that the old balance was becoming tighter. Soil added another quiet pressure. In cold northern environments, damaged ground may recover slowly. Grazing animals can open vegetation, especially when pasture is limited and winters are hard. Cutting turf for walls and roofs solved one problem while touching another, because the same thin living skin of the land helped hold soil in place. Wind, water, trampling, and use could gradually reduce what the land could give back. We should not imagine this as a single visible mistake. More often, ecological strain is a series of small withdrawals from a slow account. A little less cover, a little more erosion. A little poorer pasture, a little more labour needed to produce the same result. Over generations, children inherit not only farms and names, but also the consequences of earlier survival. The sea could help, but the sea was under climate pressure too. More difficult ice conditions could make travel uncertain, hunting dangerous, and outside contact less dependable. A settlement that leaned more heavily on marine resources also leaned more heavily on boats, weather, skilled crews, and seasonal timing. So the land and sea did not offer two separate answers. They formed one changing system. If the land gave less, people looked to the sea. If the sea became harder to use, the land had to carry more weight again. Between those forces stood the human body, needing food and warmth every day, and the human community needing enough confidence to keep its children inside the same world. This is the slow narrowing that matters most. Climate did not have to destroy Norse Greenland in one blow. It could reduce choices until every choice cost more than before. Climate becomes history when it begins to change what people can afford to repeat. For the Norse in Greenland, repetition was the foundation of life. Cut the hay, winter the animals, repair the house, hunt when the sea allowed, gather at church, teach the young, remember the dangerous places, and begin again. A society can live inside such a rhythm for a very long time, if the rhythm remains close enough to what its elders expect. But when the land slowly gives less, the old rhythm begins to lose its certainty. The problem is not only hunger in one hard year, it is the way a hard year leaves marks on the next one. Animals that survive thin may give less. Fewer young animals may be born. People who work through shortage may enter spring weaker. Tools that should be replaced may be repaired one more time. A roof that should be rebuilt may be patched. A field that needs rest may be used again because there is no other field ready to take its place. This is how a settlement can become poorer in choices before it becomes visibly poorer in ruins. The world still looks inhabited. Smoke may still rise. Prayers may still be said. Boats may still go out. But each action carries less spare strength behind it. In Greenland, this shrinking margin would have touched every layer of life. A cooler summer could mean less hay. Less hay could mean fewer cattle, and perhaps more reliance on sheep, goats, or hunted food. Greater reliance on the sea could mean more danger for those who travelled to hunting grounds. More danger could mean more losses, and losses in a small population do not remain private for long. They become missing hands, missing knowledge, missing future parents, and missing confidence. This does not require us to imagine panic. Slow pressure often produces calm decisions that make sense in the moment. A household reduces its herd. A family moves to a better farm. A community depends more on marine food. A church receives less support. A young person considers leaving, if a ship offers the chance. None of these choices is dramatic by itself. Together, they can change the shape of a people. This connects the Norse Greenlanders to a much older human story. Our ancestors survived by matching culture to environment, but the match was never final. Rivers changed course, animals moved, forests opened or closed, ice advanced or retreated. Humans endured because they could adjust, yet adjustment always had limits. In Greenland, the Norse were adjusting inside a social world that valued farms, animals, churches, and ties to Europe. They could bend toward the sea, but they did not easily become a fully Arctic hunting society. They could reduce livestock, but livestock remained tied to food, status, and identity. They could repair with scarce materials, but repair cannot replace every lost connection forever. Climate pressure therefore mattered, because it acted through everything else. It made farming harder, sea travel more uncertain, trade less predictable, and population structure more fragile. It did not stand alone like a single cause. It worked like cold through a wall, finding small openings and widening them over time. The later disappearance of the Norse from Greenland should not be told as if one winter ended everything. The evidence points more honestly toward narrowing possibilities: environmental stress, shifting trade, distance, demographic weakness, changing sea conditions, and the difficulty of reshaping a deeply inherited way of life. Their survival for centuries remains the first fact. Their vulnerability came later, not because they were simple or foolish, but because a small society at the edge of agriculture could not control all the systems on which it depended. Greenland had allowed them a place in its margins. Over time, those margins may have drawn inward, quietly asking more from each generation than the last generation had needed to give. The disappearance of the Norse from Greenland should not be imagined as a single night when every light went out. History rarely ends so neatly, especially in a small settlement spread across fjords, farms, churches, and generations. What we see from a distance is not one final scene, but a thinning record. A farm stops being used. A churchyard grows quiet. Trade becomes harder to trace. Written references become fewer. The people who once lived there do not step forward to explain themselves. They leave walls, bones, tools, graves, and questions. This is why their ending has to be told with care. It is tempting to make one cause carry the whole story. Climate, hunger, isolation, conflict, trade, disease, or migration. Each may have mattered in some way. None should be treated as a complete answer by itself. A society that lasted for centuries usually does not vanish because of one pressure alone. It becomes vulnerable when several pressures meet at the same time, and when the old ways of absorbing pressure no longer give enough protection. For the Norse in Greenland, that meeting point may have been slow. Farming margins narrowed. The sea became more important and perhaps more difficult. Trade with Europe changed. Population may have become too small in some places to support all the work that life required. Church connections may have weakened. Young people may have had fewer reasons to stay if leaving became possible. These are not dramatic images, but they are historically powerful. A settlement can end through decisions that feel practical while they are being made. One family leaves a poorer farm. Another household moves closer to better land. A church loses support. A ship comes less often. A hunting trip takes more risk. A marriage tie reaches outward. A child grows up in a community smaller than the one grandparents remembered. Nothing needs to break all at once. The structure can loosen one knot at a time. The Western settlement seems to have disappeared earlier than the Eastern settlement, reminding us that Norse Greenland was not one single body failing everywhere in the same moment. Different valleys and farms may have faced different timelines. Some places may have become unworkable before others. Some families may have moved within Greenland before leaving it entirely, if they left. Some may have died there. Some may have joined other communities or vanished into records that no longer preserve their names. We should be honest. The evidence does not let us follow every person. The silence is part of the story. This silence connects the Norse Greenlanders to a much older human reality. Across deep history, many communities have left places without leaving clear explanations. Human beings move, die, merge, adapt, and disappear from written memory far more often than they leave a final statement. Archaeology can show us patterns, but it cannot always give us a farewell. In Greenland, the absence of a clear ending may be more truthful than a dramatic conclusion. The settlement did not fail to matter because it ended. It matters because it endured so long under conditions that were never easy. Before we ask why the last farms were abandoned, we should remember the many winters that were not the last. The many children who survived, the many roofs repaired, the many animals fed, the many boats that returned. The ending, whatever its exact path, came after generations of competence. This makes the disappearance more human, not less. It suggests a community that kept solving problems until the problems became too many, too connected, or too costly for the same social form to solve. Their story does not ask us to picture a sudden collapse. It asks us to listen for a quieter kind of ending, where life continues for a long time, then slowly becomes harder to continue in the same place, in the same way, under the same inherited name. The later record of Norse Greenland becomes most difficult at the place where people most want certainty. We would like one final letter, one last witness, one clear explanation of what happened to the last households. Instead, the evidence gives us fragments. There are ruins where farms once worked. There are church sites that once gathered the living and held the dead. There are animal bones, imported objects, worn tools, and traces of changing diet. There are written references from outside Greenland that become thinner with time. These fragments do not form a single farewell. They form a silence with edges. The Western settlement appears to have been abandoned earlier, while the Eastern settlement continued longer. That difference matters because it warns us against imagining one island-wide ending. A smaller, more exposed settlement might weaken first. A better connected or more fertile area might hold on longer. Families may have moved from one district to another. Some farms may have been deserted while others still lit fires, milked animals, hunted seals, repaired boats, and buried their dead with care. The end of a community can begin while daily life still looks ordinary to those living inside it. A person may not know that a household decision belongs to history. Selling animals, moving to kin, delaying repair, sending a young person away, leaving a marginal farm, or depending more heavily on the sea might seem like practical choices, not signs of an approaching disappearance. This is one reason we must treat the Norse Greenlanders with respect. They were not characters walking toward an ending they could already see. Like all human beings, they made choices from inside, incomplete knowledge. Their world had always required adjustment, and many adjustments had worked before. More seal meat in the diet did not mean immediate failure. Fewer imported goods did not mean the next winter could not be survived. A church with less support could still remain meaningful. A farm with fewer animals could still be home. But over generations, small reductions can change the structure of possibility. A settlement may keep its name while losing the density that once made the name secure. Fewer people mean fewer marriages, fewer workers, fewer boat crews, fewer memories stored in living bodies, and fewer hands to help when one household suffers. This is the biological side of disappearance. A population is not just a count. It is an arrangement of ages, skills, kinship, fertility, health, and trust. Our species has survived across harsh places because groups could replace themselves and pass knowledge forward. When that chain becomes thin, even intelligent people become vulnerable. In Greenland, distance made this more serious. A village in a crowded region might absorb loss through nearby neighbours. A small settlement at the edge of the North Atlantic had fewer cushions. Trade could help, but only when ships came. Hunting could help, but only when weather, ice, animals, boats, and skilled people aligned. Farming could help, but only when summer produced enough stored winter. Each support depended on other supports. If several weakened together, the old system might still function, but with less room for shock. The disappearance may therefore have looked less like a dramatic collapse and more like a long retreat from certainty. Perhaps some people left when opportunity allowed. Perhaps some died in Greenland. Perhaps some were absorbed into other communities, though evidence does not let us say that confidently for the settlement as a whole. Perhaps different things happened in different valleys. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is the truth of the evidence. What remains is a picture of a society whose ending was not written in one cause, but in the slow convergence of environment, distance, trade, demography, and the limits of cultural change. The last Norse Greenlanders, whoever they were, may not have thought they were ending a 500-year story. They may simply have been trying to get through one more season, as their ancestors had done before them. The last stage of Norse Greenland may be the hardest to imagine because it left no clean voice behind. There is no final household speaking clearly across time, no certain account of the last winter, no named child closing a door and walking away. What remains is the kind of silence that historians and archaeologists must approach gently. A silence can mean many things. It can mean death. It can mean migration. It can mean records lost, memories broken, names absorbed elsewhere, or ordinary choices that were never written down because no one knew they would become the ending of a world. The Norse settlements had endured for centuries by repeating tasks that made life possible. Cutting hay, tending animals, repairing buildings, hunting seals, travelling by boat, gathering at churches, burying the dead, teaching children where safety could be found. When that pattern finally stopped, it may not have stopped everywhere at once. One farm may have emptied while another still worked. One churchyard may have grown quiet while another still received the dead. One family may have left, another may have remained, and another may have had no choice at all. A slow ending can look like life from the inside. People still wake, eat, mend, pray, and plan, even when the future has become smaller than the past. This is important because the disappearance of the Norse from Greenland is often made too dramatic in the imagination. It is easier to picture a disaster than a narrowing, but the evidence asks for patience. The Western settlement appears to have ended earlier, and the Eastern settlement later, which means the story had more than one rhythm. Distance, climate, trade, population, soil, sea ice, and cultural inheritance all pressed differently in different places. A poorer farm under pressure might be abandoned first. A stronger farm might gather people for a time. A family with kin elsewhere might choose departure. A family without such ties might remain until remaining was the only familiar act left. None of this can be followed person by person with certainty, but it fits the slower truth of small human societies under stress. The deepest human issue is not simply that they disappeared. It is that they had built a world strong enough to last, yet not flexible or connected enough to last forever. Our species often survives by carrying memory forward, but memory can become heavy when conditions change. The Norse carried farms, livestock, churches, law, status, and ties to Europe into Greenland. Those things helped them endure. They gave structure to labour, meaning to burial, value to trade, and identity to children born far from the first homelands. Yet the same structure could become difficult to reshape. To become fully something else might have meant losing the social form that made life recognisable. To remain the same required a landscape, a market, and a population that could still support that sameness. Over time, those supports may have thinned. The ending, therefore, should not be told as punishment, foolishness, or mystery for its own sake. It should be seen as a human limit. A community can be skilled and still vulnerable. It can be faithful and still hungry. It can be brave and still far away. It can adapt and still not adapt enough. By the time the last Norse traces fade, Greenland had held their lives for roughly 5 centuries. That duration matters. It means there were generations who knew no other home, who looked at fjords and pastures not as a frontier, but as the ordinary shape of life. Their disappearance did not erase their achievement. It made the achievement more fragile and more real. They survived at the edge of agriculture, at the edge of Europe, and at the edge of what their inherited world could bear. The last silence is not an answer. It is a reminder that history often ends without a witness, and that human survival is always a negotiation between memory, body, land, and time. The story of Norse Greenland leaves us with a lesson that is quieter than victory and gentler than failure. It shows that human beings can carry a way of life very far, but never outside the conditions that make life possible. The settlers brought farms, animals, ships, churches, law, memory, and the hope that a familiar world could be rebuilt on a cold coast. For a long time, that hope was not foolish. It worked well enough to feed children, bury elders, support worship, maintain trade, and keep households alive through centuries of severe winters and narrow summers. This is the first value of their story. It teaches us to respect endurance when endurance is made of ordinary labour. Most of history is not shaped by people standing in heroic poses. It is shaped by people cutting grass before rain, carrying food before winter, repairing a wall before wind enters, teaching a child before knowledge is lost, and continuing because others depend on them. In Greenland, survival was not loud, it was repeated. It was the quiet discipline of doing the necessary thing while the larger world remained far away. This matters, because modern people often imagine adaptation as a quick decision. We think that when conditions change, people should simply change with them. But the Norse story reminds us that a culture is not a shirt that can be removed without cost. A farm was food, but it was also inheritance. A church was belief, but it was also memory. A herd was milk and wool, but it was also status, identity, and the promise that children might live in a recognizable world. To change one part of such a system is to touch many others. Human beings adapt through culture, but we also need culture to remain stable enough that life feels meaningful. That tension is at the center of Greenland. The settlers survived because their old knowledge was strong. They became vulnerable when that same knowledge met pressures it could not fully solve. This is not only a medieval story, it reaches back to the beginning of our species. Humans left warmer homelands and learned cold coasts, mountains, forests, islands, and deserts, because culture allowed the body to live beyond its natural ease. We made tools, shelters, clothing, fire, boats, laws, rituals, and stories. These things protected us, but they also shaped us. They told us what counted as home, honour, food, duty, and future. The Norse Greenlanders show both sides of this gift. Culture made a society possible at the edge of the Arctic. Culture also made certain changes difficult, because every deep change asked the community to become less like the world it remembered. The educational lesson is not that they should have known everything earlier. No society sees its whole future clearly. People live inside seasons, not summaries. They make choices with the evidence near them. The hay in the barn, the animals in the byre, the ship on the horizon, the child at the hearth, the grave beside the church. Looking back, we see patterns that they could not see in full. That should make us humble. It is easy to judge the past from a safe distance. It is harder to understand how reasonable choices, repeated under changing conditions, can slowly lead a community into narrower ground. The Norse in Greenland teach that survival depends on many supports at once: land, sea, body, trade, memory, population, and trust. When those supports remain balanced, even a small society can endure for centuries. When they thin together, even a skilled society may find that effort alone is no longer enough. Their story asks us to value flexibility, but not to mock attachment. It asks us to respect tradition, but not to mistake tradition for protection against every change. It asks us to notice the quiet margins before they close. To listen to Greenland carefully is to hear how many forms of dependence make up one human life. No person survives alone, and no settlement survives by one strength. The Norse needed grass, but grass needed weather. Animals needed fodder, but fodder needed labour. Labour needed food, health, memory, and enough young people to replace the old. Boats needed wood, skill, courage, and seasons when the sea could be crossed. Trade needed ships, demand, trust, and distant buyers who still wanted what Greenland could offer. Churches needed belief, but also people, materials, food, and connection to the wider Christian world. Every support leaned on another support. This is one of the deepest lessons of their 5 centuries in Greenland. Human survival is not a straight pillar. It is a web. When one strand weakens, the others can sometimes carry more weight. But when many strands weaken together, even a careful community begins to feel the strain. This does not make the Norse Greenlanders weak. It makes them human. Our species has always lived through webs of dependence. From the first groups who shared fire, food, tools, and knowledge, people survived because no single body could hold everything alone. A child needed adults. Adults needed elders who remembered. Hunters needed gatherers, makers, watchers, healers, and storytellers. Later, farmers needed soil, rain, animals, storage, neighbours, and law. In Greenland, this ancient human pattern appeared in a cold medieval form. The farm, the fjord, the church, the ship, and the graveyard all belong to the same living system. When we ask how 5,000 Norse settlers could survive 500 years in Greenland, the answer is not one heroic quality, it is relationship. They survive by relating to animals, to land, to sea, to ancestors, to children, to distant markets, and to a God and church that placed their hardship inside a larger order. Yet relationship also meant vulnerability. If the land gave less, the animals suffered. If animals suffered, households weakened. If households weakened, churches and trade could weaken too. If ships came less often, tools and contact became harder. If the young saw fewer futures in the old valleys, population could thin. None of these changes had to announce itself as an ending. They could arrive as practical adjustments, each one understandable, each one small enough to be lived with for a while. That is why Greenland teaches patience in historical thinking. It warns us against stories that turn the past into a simple judgment. The Norse were not merely stubborn, and they were not magically wise. They were a community carrying a familiar world into an unfamiliar edge, learning enough to remain there for generations, but never becoming free from the limits around them. Their achievement and their vulnerability came from the same place. They tried to keep a meaningful life intact. For older listeners, perhaps this part of the story feels especially clear. A life is not only the body continuing, it is the house remembered, the work repeated, the people buried, the children taught, the habits that make mourning recognizable. To lose those things can feel like losing the shape of oneself. The Norse in Greenland remind us that human beings do not adapt as empty creatures. We adapt while holding memories. We change while trying not to break the thread that connects us to those before us. Sometimes that thread helps us endure. Sometimes it becomes difficult to loosen when the world has changed. The quiet value of this story is not to say that tradition is wrong, or that change is always right. It is to see that wisdom may lie in knowing which parts of memory must be carried, and which parts must be allowed to bend before the margin closes completely. Greenland leaves us with an image that is not loud. A few farms beside fjords, low houses pressed into the earth, animals breathing through winter, boats waiting for weather, churchyards holding generations, and a sea that both fed the people and kept them far from help. From a distance, it can be easy to ask why they stayed so long, or why they did not change sooner, or why they did not leave before the margins closed. But human life is usually lived from inside attachment. People do not wake each morning inside a historical lesson. They wake inside a home, with work to do, food to prepare, children to guide, animals to tend, tools to mend, and memories that make the place meaningful. The Norse Greenlanders survived for centuries because they turned a difficult coast into a world they could recognize. That recognition mattered. It gave shape to labor. It told people where they belonged. It allowed children born far from Norway or Iceland to inherit not only cold land, but a story, a language, a faith, and a way of measuring a good life. Their survival was therefore not only physical, it was cultural, social, and emotional, even if we cannot know their private feelings in detail. They kept a human pattern alive where the environment allowed only narrow answers. The final lesson is not that human beings should abandon memory whenever conditions change. Without memory, there is no teaching, no identity, no trust between generations. The lesson is also not that tradition alone can protect a community forever. The Norse brought a strong tradition to Greenland, and that strength carried them far. Yet strength can become weight when the world around it shifts. Grass may grow less reliably, trade may thin, the sea may become harder to cross, a population may lose its density. A familiar way of life may still feel right, even as it becomes harder to support. This is one of the quiet truths of human history. We survive by building stable worlds, but we remain alive by noticing when stability has begun to depend on conditions that no longer hold. Our species began with vulnerable bodies, and we covered that vulnerability with culture, fire, shelter, tools, clothing, boats, stories, rituals, and shared work. Greenland shows both the beauty and the limit of that gift. Culture allowed a small Norse society to live for roughly 5 centuries at the edge of farming. Culture also made it hard to become something entirely different when the edge grew colder, farther, and less forgiving. That does not make their story a failure. It makes it deeply human. They did what people have always done. They carried what they knew into a hard place. They learned some new things. They held on to what gave life meaning. They endured through ordinary labour long enough for the island to become ancestral ground. Then, slowly, the record faded. What remains for us is not a simple warning, but a quieter kind of education. A society is healthy when it knows how to remember and how to revise. It needs roots, but it also needs room to bend. It needs pride, but also humility before land, climate, hunger, distance, and time. The Norse settlers in Greenland remind us that survival is never only about force. It is about balance between past and future, body and belief, home and horizon, what must be kept and what must be changed. Their 500 years were not a pause before disappearance. They were real human centuries full of work, birth, death, worship, hunger, repair, and hope. And when we look back at those quiet farms beside the ice, the question that remains is not only how they survived so long, but how any human community knows when the world it has inherited must finally become something else.